Welcome back, everyone. We are diving deep today into something a lot of you requested a recap of the Geography 2050 Symposium.
Yeah, it was quite the event, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I
Right.
mean, so many perspectives all in one place. We had academics, government folks, industry leaders, even some AP human geography teachers
It
there.
was a good mix.
It really was. And, going through our notes afterward, it seemed like four big themes kept bubbling up. And what's really interesting is within each of those themes, there was a good bit of debate, even disagreement. Like everyone agreed that climate change is this, what was it, threat multiplier?
Yeah, threat multiplier.
But then what does that actually mean when you're trying to make policies or decide what actions to take? That's where things got kind of tricky.
Sure, a lot of nuance to unpack there.
So should we just jump right into those four themes then?
Let's do it.
All right, so first up, we've got the climate conflict nexus. What were some of the key takeaways from that discussion?
Well, like you said, there was that widespread agreement on climate change being a threat multiplier, right? But what that really means is it makes existing problems worse. Things like tensions over resources, how places are governed, social inequalities, all that.
So it's not like climate change is directly causing wars,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like setting the stage.
Exactly. It creates these conditions that make conflict way more likely. Like, imagine a region that's already struggling with water shortages. Then climate change comes along, you get a mega drought, and boom, things could totally explode.
Makes sense. It's rarely a simple cause and effect thing.
Right, totally. And some of the experts at the symposium were saying we need to think about it more as a spectrum,
Yeah.
cooperation, competition, and then conflict, but those things aren't always so separate.
Yeah, there's overlap.
Big time. And another point that came up a lot was there are more and more players involved in these climate-related conflicts now. It's not just countries going head-to-head. You've got these non-state armed groups, even nations trying to, take advantage of the situation for their own benefit. Actually, there was this fascinating story about Azud in Mongolia.
Azud?
Yeah, it's like this severe winter disaster they have there. And it had these huge ripple effects, even impacting a U.S. ally, which really shows how far-reaching those security implications of climate change can be.
I've never even heard of Azud. See, that's why I love these deep dives, always learning something new.
Right. It really highlights how much we need that geospatial intelligence to understand what's going on. It's not enough to just map out where the climate hazards are. We've got to be able to analyze those social and political vulnerabilities too, figure out where those conflict hotspots are most likely to pop up.
So connect the dots between the physical data about climate and the human side of things.
Exactly. And that leads us right into our second big theme, human mobility in a changing climate.
Ooh, yeah, that's a huge one. And it's only getting bigger as climate change keeps intensifying. I remember they mentioned a staggering statistic, something like 120 million forcibly displaced people globally right now.
And that number's only going up, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's projected to rise dramatically. And even though not all displacement is directly caused by climate change, those environmental stresses are a big contributing factor. Droughts, floods, rising sea levels, it's all pushing people to move, both within countries and across borders.
It's a complex issue for sure, and it raises a lot of questions about, well, how do we manage this? How do we make sure people are treated fairly and with dignity when they're forced to leave their homes? The case of Tuvalu really brought this home for me.
Tuvalu.
Yeah, that small island nation in the Pacific, they're literally facing inundation from rising sea levels. Their land is disappearing.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. It's like, what happens to a nation when its physical territory is no longer there? What happens to their sovereignty, their culture?
Huge questions. But Tuvalu is actually taking a really proactive approach, which was heartening to hear about. They've got this climate mobility agreement with Australia that allows Tuvaluans to migrate there, but in a way that tries to preserve their cultural identity and even maintain some degree of sovereignty.
That's interesting. So it's not just about fleeing. It's about, planned relocation with some safeguards in place.
Exactly. It's definitely a model worth studying, although there's still lots of questions about the legal and ethical frameworks around climate-induced migration. We still don't have a universally recognized definition of a climate refugee, which makes it hard to ensure people get the protection and assistance they need.
That's a big gap. And then there's the whole issue of climate redlining, right? Where areas deemed uninhabitable are basically written off, which could just make existing inequalities even worse.
Definitely a concern. And that's where, again, our expertise in geospatial intelligence is so crucial. We need to go beyond just mapping migration flows. We need to be thinking about human rights, about making sure the data we collect and analyze is used to find equitable solutions, not exacerbate existing problems.
So advocate for policies that protect the most vulnerable people and make sure this whole process of climate migration is handled in a humane way.
Absolutely. Okay. Ready to dive into something a little more, shall we say, technical?
Oh, yeah, bring on the geeky stuff. Yeah, this is where I thrive. So theme number 3, data technology and geospatial intelligence.
This is where things get really exciting for us, right? The symposium was like a showcase for all the latest advancements in geo-AI, Earth observation, data analytics. It was a lot to take in, but in a good way.
My head was spinning. But I was also, like, super energized, you know?
Yeah.
Like, seeing all the possibilities, what we can actually do with these tools.
Totally. We saw tools for modeling climate change impacts on everything, food security, infrastructure, you name it. And then there were these amazing examples of real-time data being used for early warning systems and disaster response. I remember one story about Planet Labs. They used their satellite network to capture images of a massive ice sheet collapse in Greenland, all in real time.
Real time. That's incredible. It wasn't that long ago that getting that kind of data would take in, like, weeks, if not months.
Right. The technology is advancing so rapidly. But of course, there are challenges too, right? One of the biggest ones that kept coming up was computational costs. Some of these advanced models need so much processing power, it can be a barrier to open science. And it can even lead to people not trusting AI-driven insights, if they're not sure how the sausage is being made.
So how do we ensure that everyone has access to those powerful insights, even if they don't have a supercomputer in their basement? How do we promote transparency and build trust in these models?
Big questions for sure, and these are things the geospatial community is definitely grappling with. We need to find ways to make those powerful tools and the data they use more accessible. After all, those insights are crucial for everyone, not just governments and big organizations. Local communities, especially those on the front lines of climate change, need them too.
So democratizing access to geospatial knowledge so that everyone can make informed decisions and build a more sustainable future sounds like a worthy goal.
Couldn't agree more. All right, ready to tackle our final theme.
Hit me with it.
Okay, so this one might sound a bit, well, obvious, but it was something that just kept echoing throughout the entire symposium, the need for cooperation and solutions.
Yeah, I think the sense of urgency was palpable, wasn't it? Like, we have to break down those silos, stop working in isolation. We need everyone on board, different disciplines, different sectors, governments, businesses, communities, everyone if we're going to tackle these challenges of climate change and security.
Totally. But the good news is, we actually saw a ton of great examples of this collaboration already happening. Like, there's this initiative called the Complex Risk Analytics Fund, or CRFT, which brings together governments, international organizations, and research institutions to share resources and expertise.
Yeah, and they're focused on developing data collection and forecasting tools to better understand and address climate fragility.
Right, and then there's the U.S. Global Change Research Program. They're taking the lead on making climate information more accessible and user-friendly, which is crucial. They were showcasing this cool climate mapping for resilience and adaptation portal that integrates tons of different data layers to help communities plan for climate impacts.
So putting those tools directly in the hands of the people who need them.
Exactly. And what I found really inspiring was all the focus on empowering young people and encouraging knowledge sharing between generations. We heard about the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's Terran program. They connect students and faculty with intelligence professionals to work on real-world geospatial challenges. It's awesome to see the energy and passion of those next-gen geospatial experts.
Gives you hope for the future, right?
It really does.
Well, this has been a fantastic overview of those 4 big themes that emerged from Geography 2050. We've only scratched the surface, though, right?
Oh, yeah, there's so much more to unpack.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll dig into some of those specific case studies and technological advancements that really brought these themes to life.
Can't wait.
Okay, so we've outlined those 4 big themes from Geography 2050, but I'm itching to get into some specifics. What were some of the real standout moments that brought these themes to life?
That's a great question. One session that really resonated with me focused on the complexities of climate-driven migration. It was titled Extent of Human Mobility and Immobility in a Changing Climate. And it brought together such a fascinating mix of perspectives.
Oh, I remember that one. It sounds kind of dry on paper, but it was actually quite riveting. You had researchers presenting these incredible population models they've developed, and policymakers grappling with the legal gray areas of climate displacement.
Right, and even folks sharing firsthand accounts from communities already on the move.
Right.
It was powerful stuff.
Was. One of the big takeaways for me was even though climate change is contributing to migration, it's rarely the sole cause. You really have to consider how that environmental stress interacts with all these other vulnerabilities, social, economic, political, to get the whole picture.
100%. You can't just look at a map of drought-stricken areas and assume everyone's going to pick up and leave. People's decisions are way more complex than that.
Exactly. Their ties to the land, their ability to adapt, access to resources, it all plays a role.
Absolutely. And that's where some of those high-powered geospatial tools we were talking about come in. Some researchers presented models that can actually predict migration patterns based on all sorts of factors, projected sea level rise, economic indicators, even social network data.
It's mind-blowing how much data we can now integrate to get a more accurate and honestly a more humane understanding of migration. We're moving beyond just numbers on a map and seeing the real human stories behind those movements.
Speaking of human stories, there's this very moving presentation about the Fulani people in West Africa. They're traditionally nomadic herders, but with all the increasing climate stress, it's really disrupting their way of life.
Leading to displacement and conflict over those dwindling resources?
Yeah.
Exactly. That presentation really stuck with me. It highlighted the importance of cultural context. It's not enough to just map out, like, grazing lands and water sources. You have to understand that for the Fulani, their whole identity, their livelihoods, their very being is intertwined with the land and their herds.
It's so true. The speaker emphasized that these communities aren't simply victims of circumstance. They have generations of traditional knowledge and coping mechanisms that need to be recognized and supported.
And that brings up another point that kept coming up, the value of local knowledge. Those on-the-ground insights can be just as important as, big data when you're trying to really understand the impacts of climate change.
For sure. We heard about indigenous communities in the Arctic using geospatial tools to document those changes in their environment. They're tracking melting permafrost, shifting animal migration patterns, basically. They're creating their own maps of climate change as it unfolds around them.
Makes sense. Who better to document a changing landscape than the people who have lived in and depended on that landscape for centuries?
Right, and their knowledge isn't just valuable for understanding local impacts. It can inform those adaptation strategies at a much broader scale.
So how do we, as geospatial professionals, help bridge that gap between local knowledge and scientific data? How do we make sure those voices are heard and that those communities benefit from the data being collected?
That's the key question, isn't it? I think it all comes down to partnerships, really building those relationships built on mutual respect and trust.
Yeah.
We need to be co-creating data collection and analysis methods that are scientifically rigorous, but also incorporate that traditional ecological knowledge.
There were some really cool examples of that collaborative work happening. Projects using drones to map indigenous lands, participatory mapping initiatives that empower communities to tell their own stories, even mobile apps that allow people to report environmental changes in real time. It's amazing to see how technology can be used to bridge that gap.
Yeah. And as those technologies become more accessible, that potential for community-based geospatial work is only going to grow, which actually transitions nicely into the next area, all that cool tech that was showcased at Geography 2050.
Oh yeah, let's geek out for a minute. Remember all that talk about open science and data accessibility? There was a whole session dedicated to GeoAI and its potential to drive, well, global progress.
It wasn't just hype either. We saw some real concrete examples of how artificial intelligence is being used alongside geospatial data to address these complex challenges. There were platforms that can automatically classify land cover types from satellite imagery, which is a game changer for monitoring deforestation or planning urban growth.
I was totally blown away by that project that's developing a global database of field boundaries for agriculture. Imagine no more painstakingly digitizing those boundaries from aerial photos. That kind of standardized data could revolutionize how we monitor agriculture and make decisions.
For sure. But even with all the excitement, those concerns about the computational costs of AI were still a big topic of conversation.
Yeah, that came up a lot.
One speaker even argued that the current cost of building and running these sophisticated models is actually a major barrier to both open science and building trust in the insights they generate.
It's a real catch-22, isn't it? We have these incredibly powerful tools that could help us solve some of humanity's biggest problems. But if only a handful of, well-funded institutions can access them, how can we ensure that the knowledge is used ethically and for the benefit of all?
Tough questions. No easy answers there, but at least these challenges are being openly acknowledged. The geospatial community seems very aware of those potential pitfalls of AI and is actively looking for solutions.
So what's our role in all of this?
Mm.
How can we, as geospatial professionals, make sure AI is being used responsibly and for good?
Well, I think it starts with advocating for those ethical guidelines and open data standards. We need to be pushing for tools and platforms that are transparent and accessible to a wider audience.
And we need to be engaging with those communities and policymakers, right? Making sure AI is actually addressing their needs and priorities.
100%. And speaking of policymakers, there were some really fascinating discussions at the symposium about how geospatial intelligence is being used to actually inform policy
Oh,
decisions.
yeah, those are great.
We heard from representatives of the State Department and the NGA about how they're using geospatial data to track those conflict trends, support humanitarian efforts, monitor environmental changes, even anticipate security threats.
And what was encouraging was that both agencies seem really focused on making their data and analysis more accessible to the public. We even got a peek at some of their incredible mapping platforms that are used for everything from disaster response to peacekeeping operations.
Seriously impressive stuff.
It's clear that geospatial intelligence is playing a more and more vital role in addressing those big global challenges we keep talking about. And that means that we, as geospatial professionals, have a real opportunity, I'd even say a responsibility, to make a difference.
It's about bridging that gap between data and action,
Uh,
right? Using our skills to inform policy, to empower communities, and to contribute to building a more just and sustainable world.
which is a perfect segue to the final part of our deep dives, where we'll unpack all those compelling calls to action that came out of Geography 2050. All right, we've explored those big themes, again, some fascinating examples from Geography 2050, but I'm really curious about the so what. What were those key takeaways in terms of action? What can we, as geospatial professionals, actually do with all this information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thankfully, Geography 2050 didn't shy away from it. There were some really inspiring calls to action throughout the symposium, challenging us to step up and use our skills to shape a more sustainable and just future.
I'm all ears. What were some of the most compelling ones?
Well, one thing that kept coming up was this need to shift from focusing on the problems to focusing on solutions. You've talked about some pretty heavy stuff, right? Climate change, conflict, displacement. It's easy to get bogged down in all the doom and gloom.
It can be overwhelming for sure.
But what Geography 2050 really highlighted were those incredible innovations and those success stories happening all over the world.
Yeah, we need that, right? Negativity can be paralyzing. Seeing those success stories, those like glimmers of hope, can be incredibly motivating.
It reminds us that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges.
Exactly. And there were some great examples presented. I remember one about a company using geospatial data to track wildlife populations in Africa, helping make those conservation efforts more effective.
Oh, that's right. And there was another one developing these more equitable insurance models to make sure that the most vulnerable communities have access to the protection they need.
That one was really interesting. The speaker was saying how these solutions aren't just about doing good. They're about creating viable business models that can actually drive positive change.
It makes sense.
Yeah. He even mentioned a startup that's using geospatial data to help insurance companies assess risk, and they're doing incredibly well.
Wow.
It's a reminder that investing in geospatial innovation can be good for the planet and the bottom line.
For sure. It's about demonstrating that geospatial thinking isn't just for, academics and government agencies. It's for entrepreneurs, for investors, for businesses of all sizes.
That's a message we need to get out there. And speaking of reaching a wider audience, the symposium also emphasized the importance of empowering youth and fostering that intergenerational collaboration. There were so many young researchers and entrepreneurs sharing their work, and their energy was contagious.
I know, right? It was so inspiring to see their passion and creativity. Remember that presentation about the Terran Initiative we mentioned earlier, where they're connecting students with intelligence professionals to work on real-world challenges? That's a perfect example of how we can get that next generation excited about using geospatial skills to make a difference.
And they are excited. It's clear the young people want to be part of the solution. We need to create more opportunities for them to get involved, connect them with mentors, give them the resources to, turn their ideas into reality.
Absolutely. They're the ones inheriting this planet, so they need to be equipped to tackle the challenges we're well, we're leaving behind. And this kind of ties into another really thought-provoking presentation that stuck with me. Dr. Nathaniel Bassett, he challenged the audience to think critically about knowledge production.
Okay.
He asked what geographies do matter. Just reminding everyone that data is always rooted in a specific location and context.
It's easy to forget that when you're staring at a screen full of data points.
Right. We can get so focused on that abstract analysis that we lose sight of the real people and real places behind those maps and data sets.
So how do we bring it back down to earth?
Well, he argued that to effectively address these big local challenges, we need to engage with those communities, on a human level, listen to their stories, understand their needs, and work together to create solutions that fit their specific context.
It can't just be a top-down approach.
Exactly. We need to be working hand in hand with those most impacted, using geospatial tools to amplify their voices and support their vision for the future.
Couldn't agree more. And finally, I think it's important to remember that while systems change is crucial, those big policy shifts, individual actions still matter too. We can't just sit back and wait for governments and corporations to solve everything. It starts with each of us looking in the mirror and saying, okay, what choices am I making that are contributing to these challenges? How can I use my geospatial knowledge to be more informed, make those more sustainable decisions?
There was a great point about that. Someone brought up personal carbon footprints and how geospatial tools can help us visualize the impact of our everyday choices, from the food we eat to how we travel. It's like holding up a mirror to our own lives.
And asking, are we walking the walk?
Exactly, because change ultimately starts with each of us. It starts with recognizing that our actions have consequences, that we're all interconnected, and that we have a shared responsibility to care for this planet.
Well said. So as we wrap up this Geography 2050 deep dive, what's the one big message you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I think the takeaway is that in a world facing such complex challenges, geospatial thinking is no longer a niche skill. It's like a fundamental literacy.
It's the ability to see the world through that spatial lens, understand those patterns and connections, and use data to tell stories and make informed decisions that contribute to a better future.
And whether our listener is, a seasoned geospatial professional or just starting out, they have a role to play. We all do.
Absolutely. Geography 2050 really drove home the point that the future is not predetermined. It's something we create collectively through our actions and choices.
And we have those tools and the knowledge to create a future that's more just, more sustainable, more resilient for everyone.
Well, that's about as inspiring an ending as we could hope for. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Geography 2050. I hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we did.